This is Chapter 6, Deviance, Part 3. Some of you guys are probably not feeling so hot right now, not in terms of illness or anything, but from kind of being thrown into such a weird, and everyone keeps on using the word unprecedented, but it hasn't really happened before in terms of most of our lifespans. Hopefully it will start getting easier. It does take your brain a while to adjust to things. But I'm going to keep on recording these lectures. Hopefully it'll help you study for the quizzes and maybe provide a little bit of distraction too. So I'm moving on from conflict theory and how power then is evident in our understandings of normal and deviant, to the symbolic interaction theories that are related to deviance. So we have two major ones that I'm going to be talking about. The first one is called differential association. So that is on slide 11 with the basic PowerPoint. So differential association is one of the symbolic interactionist theories of deviance. Like I said before, in sociology, everything has multiple names. So generally when people talk about differential association, it's easiest to learn it or to think of it as learning theory. So differential association, also known as learning theory. And this was a theory proposed by Sutherland in 1939. And it's a pretty easy concept. And in this case, I kind of say, well, theorists get credited for saying things that moms have been saying since the dawn of time. And your mom probably has told you at some point or another in your childhood, don't hang around with bad kids because then you'll start doing bad stuff, right? So differential association or learning theory basically says we learn to be deviant through our interactions with other people. You can think about this in terms of the last chapter, groups, and we saw then that how social influence works in terms of the Ash experiment. Well, differential association basically says that, who we associate with actually influences how we think of what is normal and what is not. So, you guys probably think I'm obsessed with vapes. Not really obsessed with vapes. It's just an interesting phenomenon that just as peer pressure had become very high to not smoke cigarettes anymore. I think this pretty much became a stigmatized thing. Not many teenagers were smoking cigarettes. Then vapes came along, right? And they're not as smelly. They were purported to be a lot more healthy than cigarettes. And because of it, there was a lot of social influence, a lot of peer pressure to start vaping. Okay. Now, when it comes to differential association, we actually look at this sociological study by Howard Becker. Now, if you guys remember earlier on in the semester, I told you guys we were going to be talking about weed smoking quite a bit. And this is the segment that we talk about it. Becker in 1953 did a study called Becoming a Marijuana User. Now, if you're looking at slide 12, you see that it is, once again, marijuana spelled with an H, simply because we didn't actually know how Spanish worked back then. And the J sound then, we used an H. Now, what happened with Becker is we generally think of addiction or drug use as motivated by physiological factors. That is, you get high, some people like the way that feels, and therefore they are more prone to engage in behaviors like smoking. But just like how Durkheim wanted to see if there were social factors involved with suicide, Becker wanted to see, okay, well then what are the social aspects of becoming a regular weed smoker? So his research question was this: how does someone go from the very first time of smoking to being a regular smoker, someone who uses it habitually? He wanted to know then, is there a social component to drug use? Okay. So what he did in this case is he took a research sample and he used two different categories. The first then were patients who were being treated for weed addiction at the time. So they were already in treatment centers for being regular smokers. And the second one is he was a jazz musician himself. So he snowballed sampled and interviewed jazz musicians. And, there's been a long kind of connection between music and weed smoking. So it is kind of a natural association to make. So the research method that he used in terms of his study was interview research. That is, he asked face-to-face questions and basically was able to kind of go off the original responses to get more information. Okay, so when it came to his research, basically what he did was he looked at this idea that you usually don't actually just decide out of the blue to smoke weed all by yourself. And, back then there was no YouTube. I guess right now, if you wanted to figure out how to smoke weed, you could always check a YouTube video, right? But what he found is that first-time usage was generally in the company of other people, right? So it's not so much that you decide, oh, hey, I'm all by myself, I think I'll smoke some weed. Instead, there was a process of teaching and learning. So what he did is he called then the new person the novice, and then the experienced person then basically was the teacher in this situation. So he wanted to see then what were the interactions between the teachers and the novices when it came to this idea of how do you become a regular weed smoker. Now, I actually go away from Becker from a second because he doesn't actually talk about these items, but I'm going to say, well, it's 2020 in New York State, and some of the things that you actually have to know before you even get to the point that you are smoking is, well, the first is you have to learn the lingo, because what would the reactions be if someone, who looked like me walked up to you and said, "Excuse me, do you know where I could locate some marijuana?" You'd probably look at me and go, "Oh, narc. This is someone who doesn't know what they're talking about, and I am not going to answer this question because I will end up in jail," right? I'm probably not in jail anymore. You'll get a fine. Instead, you kind of you have to learn then all of the terminology to refer to weed in a way that other people know, well, you actually know what you're talking about. And it is one of my exercises that I find very fun in class. What I generally used to do when we do whole class is I ask the class to come up with as many terms for weed as possible. It is an interesting exercise. Some classes actually are a lot more into it than others. Some of them then everyone's just really quiet, and I don't know if they think, oh yeah, if you know the word, then you must be a smoker. Instead, what I argue is you hear the terminology, you hear the slang. I think in the lowest end of the terms that are being used, then I think the lowest that a class has ever done is about 7 terms, but I also think that they were kind of hesitant to say anything. Some of my classes get really, really competitive, and they get up to 25, 26 words. Some of you watching this video are probably thinking, well, I can actually come up with 25 or 26 terms on my own. But the whole point is that when it comes to weed, because it was contraband for a very long time, you had to use code words to talk about it, right? You had to kind of talk about it without directly referring to it. And so you saw that there were a lot of terms out there that you have to learn in order to actually do the second part, which is learning how to acquire weed. That it is still a Schedule I drug federally, and it's only legal for recreational use in 11 states. So New York State, which is still really surprising to me, you only have medical usage that is completely legal. Other than that, then it's decriminalized. So like I said before, you don't actually get arrested, but you do get fined for possession. Okay, so those are two things that you actually have to do before you even get to what Becker was talking about. That is, you have to learn how to refer to it. And the second is, well, you actually have to learn how to find some, right? To get some. And some of you guys are laughing because you're like, well, what do you have to learn about that? But if you think about it, there are people who, if you said, okay, go find some weed right now, would have absolutely no way to do it. They wouldn't know exactly what they were supposed to do in order to obtain it. So what Becker maintains is that when you are looking at this idea of becoming a habitual smoker, you have to look at these following things, right? And the first one is this, let me see, which is learning the technique, that you need to learn how to smoke in order for it to actually work or be useful at all. Now, what he found when he did his interviews is that learning actually took two different ways in terms of learning the technique. There were indirect learners and there were direct learners. Okay, so direct learners, it was very easy. They admit that they're novices. They ask then for coaching, saying, hey, I've never done this before. What do I do? Indirect learners then want to hide the fact that they're new and learn through observation instead. So I actually included the PDF for this one, but I am going to read some of the data excerpts because I think they're amusing. It was 1953, and what you find is that jazz musicians talked much differently back then than we do now. So this novice actually talks about the idea of direct teaching. He says, I was smoking like I did an ordinary cigarette. He said, no, don't do it like that. He said, suck it, draw in and hold it in your lungs for a period of time. I said, is there any limit of time to hold it? And he said, no, just till you feel like you want to let it out, let it out. So I did that 3 or 4 times, right? And that one's very easy. He asked and he got answers. In this case, then the guy did not want anyone to know that he didn't know how to smoke. And he says, I came on like I had turned on, and just as a warning, turned on in this case actually means getting high, and getting off doesn't mean what it does now. Back then it meant getting sober. So turning on and getting off then means something totally different in terms of the study. So he says, I came on like I'd turned on many times before, I didn't want to seem like a punk to this cat. See, like I didn't know the first thing about it, how to smoke it or what was going to happen or what. I just watched him like a hawk. I didn't take my eyes off of him for a second because I wanted to do everything just as he did it. I watched how he smoked it, how he held it, how he smoked it, and everything. Then when he gave it to me, I just came on cool, as though I knew exactly what the score was. I held it like he did and took a poke just the way he did. Okay. Now, what Becker argues is that no one who didn't learn the technique actually continued smoking, because if you don't learn how to smoke, then you never get high. There'd be no purpose to smoking if you have no physiological effects. Okay. So the second item in terms of what Becker says needs to go on to become a regular weed smoker, the second part is learning how to perceive the effects. And what he found through his interviews is that most people actually don't know that or don't experience being high the first time. Now, you would think, well, wouldn't you know you were high because your body is being different than it normally is? But how I explain it to people is that unless you've physiologically experienced something before, you don't know how it feels, right? So, for instance, if you've never given birth before, you can watch all the childbirth videos that you want. You can, read all the accounts of being pregnant that you can, and you still don't know what it feels like to give birth. Okay. I tell people this, that I knew it was going to be cold when I moved to Rochester, but until I actually felt what it felt like at below 0 degrees, I had no idea how that actually felt. I didn't realize that you could have your bones actually be cold. So what Becker says is that there is a process of learning how to perceive the effects of smoking weed. Okay. So in this case, and I will kind of explain it with this excerpt. So Howard Becker says, I was told during an interview, as a matter of fact, I seen a guy who was out of his mind, high out of his mind, and didn't know it. Becker says, how can that be, man? And the interviewee said, well, it's pretty strange, I grant you that, but I seen it. This guy got on with me, claiming that he'd never got high, one of those guys, and he got completely stoned. And he kept insisting that he wasn't high. So I had to prove that he was. Okay. So there are two things to it. One says you have the physiological experience, but you also have to learn how to attach that to the smoking of weed. So this person says this, and this is a direct learner. I didn't get high that first time. I don't think I held it in long enough. I probably let it out, you're a little afraid. The second time I wasn't sure, and he told me, like, I asked him for some of the symptoms or something. How would I know? So he told me to sit on a stool. I think I sat on a bar stool, and he said, let your feet hang. And then when I got down, my feet were real cold, and I started feeling it, That was the first time. Then about a week after that, sometime pretty close to it, I really got on. That was the first time I got in a big laughing kick, Then I really knew I was on. Okay, so that's a direct learner. The second excerpt is from an indirect learner, and I don't know, every time I read this excerpt, I think maybe he was high when he did the interview. Sociologists are not as nice as journalists. That is, sociologists actually record every single word that you say, every pause, all of that. Generally, journalists are a little bit nicer, and they kind of smooth out the interview so that it sounds nicer. Here is how that guy sounds. So once again, indirect learner, and he says, they're just laughing the hell out of me because I was eating so much. I just scoffed so much food and they were just laughing at me, Sometimes I'd be looking at them, wondering why they're laughing, not knowing what I was doing. Becker asks, well, did they tell you why they were laughing eventually? And he says, yeah, I come back, hey man, what's happening? I'd ask what's happening, and all of a sudden I feel weird, Man, you're on, you're on pot. And I said, no, am I? I don't really know what's happening. Okay. So in that case, right, once again, he doesn't know that his behaviors are off until someone from the group actually tells him, hey, you're high, this is why you are acting this way. Okay. So the third part of it sounds kind of counterintuitive because we think, well, people smoke weed because they like being high. What Becker argues is, well, it's actually kind of scary for a lot of people the very first time because they haven't experienced it physiologically. Now, usually I ask the class then, what are the symptoms of being high? And it's interesting because when I first started teaching, people were a lot more hesitant to actually mention the effects. Now it's pretty much people just jump in right away to tell me what the effects are. But essentially, when you think about it, if you just woke up and out of the blue, you were really, really hungry and your eyes were bloodshot and you couldn't keep them open. If you were completely dissociated and couldn't remember exactly what you had said 2 minutes before, if you had this kind of time and space distortion, that is, you think that you're pointing at something and instead you're actually doing this, right? You would think that there was something really, really wrong, that you were sick. So what Becker argues is that because that first time is really scary, most people actually have to learn how to enjoy the effects. And what happens in that case is generally there's some coaching, some teaching going on. So in this case, I talk about, here we go. Talk about this guy who basically talks about how scary it was the first time. It started taking effect and I didn't know what was happening, what it was. And I was very sick. I walking around the room, trying to get off, you know. It just scared me at first, you know. I wasn't used to that kind of feeling, okay? And so what happens is a lot of times you see this peer pressure going on in order to become a regular smoker. In this case, then, the guy's experience the very first time was horrible. He had violent thirst, he got anxious and panicky, he had some real distortion of spatial relations and sounds. He just didn't enjoy it. And so what he says is this: after the first time, I didn't turn on for about, I'd say, 10 months to a year. It wasn't a moral thing. It was because I'd gotten so frightened being so high. And I didn't want to go through that again. I mean, my reaction was, well, if this is what they call being high, I don't dig it. So I didn't turn on for a year almost, account of that. Well, my friends started, and consequently, I started again. But I didn't have that same initial reaction after I started turning on again. So in this case, you are looking at the kind of what Ash's experience showed, which is social influence. Peer pressure then actually gets you to do stuff that you may not necessarily want to do. And this last excerpt is from a teacher. It's the only one that is from an experienced person. And he actually talks about how he coaches people through not liking how to smoke and to smoke again. And he says, well, they get pretty high sometimes. The average person isn't ready for that, and it's a little frightening to them sometimes. I mean, they've been high on Lush, and they got higher that way than they've ever been before, and they don't know what's going to happen to them. Because they think they're going to keep going up, 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 till they lose their minds or begin doing weird things or something. You have to reassure them. Explain to them that they're not really flipping or anything, that they're going to be all right. You have to just talk them out of being afraid. Keep talking to them, reassuring them, telling them that it's all right. And come on with your own story, you know. The same thing happened to me. You'll get to like it after a while. Keep coming on like that. Pretty soon you talk them out of being scared. And besides, they see you doing it and nothing horrible is happening to you, so that gives them more confidence. Okay. So what you see is that Beckert actually showed then that even though it is something very physiological and something that we think of as, okay, you physically like it, therefore you do it, there really is a learned social component when it comes to weed smoking. Okay, so back to learning theory and differential association. The main critiques of learning theory and differential association is, first, because it is a micro theory, it doesn't actually explore how something becomes deemed deviant in the first place. And generally, as sociologists, we look at conflict theory. And if you remember, I just talked about Reinerman's social construction of drug scares. You can actually look to conflict theory to see why we think smoking weed is deviant in the first place. The second is that I always say humans are messy, right? There is always an exception to the rule that in any social group, any group of friends who go out and do things like drink and get high, etc., there is usually that one person who is always invited, who is considered integral to the group, but never engages in the drinking or the smoking or whatever. Usually that person then ends up taking all the responsibility of the group, called a DD, right? Designated driver. And let me tell you that it's not always fun being designated driver, simply because if you're sober, then sometimes drunk and high people are completely obnoxious, right? Okay, so that took a while for me to get through differential association, so I'm going to stop here, and I am going to devote the next section to labeling theory, which is our second symbolic interactionist theory, okay?